Welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast. We're glad you're here. And now our host, Dr. Mike Patterson.
It's Dr. Mike Patterson, your host of the Mission First People Always podcast, where we talk about what it takes to be a great leader and how to build great teams. I'm glad you're with us today. If you like what you hear on today's episode, subscribe or follow, leave a review, tell a friend, post it on social media, put up a billboard next to a busy interstate, do something to let people know we're here. Seriously, when you follow us or leave a review, it helps other people find us, and it allows us to spread the good word about good leadership and good teamwork more broadly. Let's talk about today's topic. We're going to explore some scholarly research about the leadership characteristics of Navy SEALs, with a focus on how they work as teams. The SEALs are supermen to many of us. We know much about their lauded courage and their commitment and their sacrifice, their heroism, their willingness to go anywhere on the world and take on America's enemies, and their ability to get the job done under any circumstances. But few of us know how exactly that happens from a leadership perspective. Our guest today is not a Navy SEAL. He didn't even serve in the military, but he has great respect, as I do, and a deep curiosity about the special operations community. So much so that he undertook the challenge of studying the Navy SEALs' approach to leadership with the academic rigor required of a doctoral dissertation. His findings are fascinating and provide useful insights for managers and leaders who need to accomplish any mission in an unstable and fast-changing environment. I think you're going to really enjoy this episode.
Welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast, where we talk about better business results, stronger teams, more successful careers, and happier lives. Along the way, we hope to bust some biases, build some bridges, and have some fun. We're glad you're here. And now, our host, Dr. Mike Patterson.
My guest today is Dr. David Livingston. David is the managing partner of the McChrystal Academy, part of the McChrystal Group located in Alexandria, Virginia. The McChrystal Group was founded by retired four-star Army General Stanley McChrystal, who's most famous for his command of the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, during the Global War on Terror. At the McChrystal Group, David leads a team of subject matter experts, learning designers, and dynamic facilitators who develop and deliver custom learning courses and programs that leverage a variety of experiential learning methods, including some really effective simulations that I've had a chance to be part of and see, to drive individual growth and higher performance for teams and organizations. Now, the reason I'm so excited about having David on the show today is that while most of us will never do what Navy SEALs do, more and more of us are working in volatile, uncertain, and ever-changing environments these days. There are a lot of shifting sands in what we thought were stable business opportunities. So leaders need to know how to lead their teams in these fast-changing times. And David has studied this in a very deep and thoughtful way. David, welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast. I'm glad you're here.
Thanks, Mike. Really glad to have the conversation today.
Well, we just met a few weeks ago when I joined one of my clients for an executive development program. Your team did for us at the McChrystal Group there in Alexandria, and I was really, really impressed. The training you and your colleagues provided was just truly outstanding, and the way you worked together with your team, with your colleagues, was very professional. So I wanted to get to know you better. And as we were talking there in Virginia, we soon discovered that we had a mutual friend, Dr. Gil Brady. Gil has been a past guest on the show. He was your classmate in your doctoral program at George Washington University. I've known Gil for 30 plus years, and I'm finding that whenever I encounter a really high quality person in the leadership training space, we often have a common connection to Dr. Gil. So that's kind of neat that we have a mutual friend.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think you nailed it when it comes to Gil, when it comes to being thoughtful and really, it's interesting having his background, which matches so closely up to many of the individuals that I get to work with. So it's always a pleasure to connect with him. And it was certainly a unforeseen, but a nice connection with you as well.
Yeah, well, I'm excited for this conversation, and one of the reasons I'm so excited is that I've worked with doctoral students for the last dozen of years or so, and one of the big decision points for them is what to focus their dissertation research on. So you made a really important decision a few years ago to study the Navy SEALs. Let's begin with just you telling us how you made that decision, what caused you to become interested in what they do. How did this all come together for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. It was interesting. I think back to when I was a child, and a lot of my friends, they loved Superman or they loved Batman. And I was always much more interested in the X-Men or the Avengers. It was the team aspect that really got me excited, even as a child. Right? It was this idea of being a part of something greater than oneself, and that you were part of this group that was able to bring together the best, that you could offer to deliver something and to execute on a real challenge. And as I kind of grew up and looked around and really started to engage with the different teams around me, I found that the Navy SEALs over and over again kind of fit that same bill. That while they were individually truly impressive, incredible, and people, it was the collective part of them that really made me excited. And when I was looking through kind of what to do for my dissertation, I knew it was going to be around that team aspect. I hadn't really settled yet on the SEALs, but I got some really good advice. And the advice was pick something in your dissertation that you are absolutely in love with and enamored by, because at some point in that journey of being a doctoral student, you're going to hate everything about your dissertation. You are going to be exhausted and worn down. And there better be something that still captures that fire inside of you to keep pushing you along. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. During the dissertation itself, went through some really traumatic experiences from a personal level. My father passed away unexpectedly. We had our first child. During that pregnancy, my wife was diagnosed with an aggressive form of ovarian cancer, and she went through chemotherapy in the midst of doing all this and working full time. And so there were lots of reasons why I didn't want to continue working on the dissertation. But the one thing that kind of continued to pique my interest, even through that year and a half of real challenges, was I kept opening the books to read about the Navy SEALs, because they were such a unique culture and that collectivism that I really wanted to understand. And so in many ways, I attribute being able to finish that to my true interest in the SEALs. And that's why even when people tried to dissuade me and say, pick another type of team that is easier to access and to get around, I really kind of stuck to my guns and stubbornly continued to make sure that I pursued understanding that particular team.
Now, speaking of easier to access, the SEALs are generally not all that open to civilians about their techniques. And one of the things I know from working with dissertation students is you need to access data. You need to connect with your participants so that you can get the data you need to do your research. How did you gather your data with a group of people who are generally a pretty closed community?
Yeah. I was able to actually connect to a couple of individuals specifically who had left the teams recently, who had either retired or had moved on to another type of occupation. And it took a little bit of time to start, once you got into the community and you started to establish your bona fides as someone who wasn't trying to, hurt the teams in some way, shape, or form, or simply to really try to exploit that type of relationship, but rather, I think I was able to connect in a way that they realized what I was really hoping to do was to uncover what they did so well so that we could distill it down to something practical and hand it to other teams. And once I was able to convince a few of them, again, actually in the same way, because they're such a tight brotherhood and they knew oftentimes the next person that I should talk to, they helped me make those connections. And using people who were outside of the teams helped to kind of avoid some of the red tape, which is understandable. So around, current missions. And what I always asked them were about previous missions, and I scrubbed the data very hard for any kind of names or locations, things that might expose the country or the teams or any active duty individuals to any kind of harm, to make sure that it was always in a way that we could still pull out the really valuable contextual information without creating any kind of security concerns.
Yeah, that speaks a lot to your ability to connect with people and gain their trust. And that's really most impressive, David. Let's get into your research. As with most doctoral research, scholars use some terms that most regular people don't use on a daily basis, but you do so with good reason. And to make sure that we're all on the same page as we proceed, I'm going to invite you to define some key terms that I quickly ran across in reading your dissertation. And I'm going to invite you to define those terms in a way that, all of us can easily understand, and maybe make some connections to your research, why these terms matter, why they were a focus of your work. So I'm going to give you three terms. And the first one is dynamic instability. What does that mean? And, translate that into, day-to-day, everyman sort of terms for us.
Yeah, it's a great question. Sometimes it's also referred to in the literature as bounded instability. But really, what we're talking about is this idea that originates from complexity theory that looks at how systems interact. And the fundamental idea of dynamic instability says the most adaptive systems, and you could replace systems with teams, right? The most adaptive teams that are out there exhibit this really interesting combination of highly structured, mechanisms in ways that they are, very stable and predictable, but they also exhibit these very interesting, highly flexible characteristics as well. And so it's not meeting in, a mishmash in between, but rather they're simultaneously high at both of these things. And it allows an organization or a team or a Navy SEAL unit to operate at something called the edge of chaos, which is a great term that Lewin really popularized. And again, it's this idea of finding this really interesting balance point. If you think about it like a seesaw or a teeter-totter, the edge of chaos would be that vertice that it balances on. But the way that you balance isn't by standing right on top of the vertice, it's having high levels of both of those stability and high levels of flexibility. And so it's this idea of how do effective teams create that in a really practical way, whether it's through culture or through, different types of processes, different types of training or mechanisms that they use to maintain that really fascinating and important balance at that edge of chaos.
Okay, we're going to come back to that and the how do teams do it part, but let's go to our second term, action team.
Yeah, so an action team is kind of this classification of teams that also encompass not only military units like the Navy SEALs, but performance groups, like a jazz ensemble. It includes, a surgical team, maybe a police force. It's really teams that fundamentally both require a high level of connectivity. They require a high level of communication because the environment that they operate in changes all the time. The last component of an action team is it also requires a high level of expertise. These are individuals who are highly skilled. They're not, simply a bunch of folks thrown together into a hard situation, but rather they've been trained in very specific ways to be effective.
So the reality is many of the folks listening to the podcast today are members of action teams, but maybe they've never used that term, but the description you just gave fits what they do and who they are.
Absolutely. I would say most teams, particularly over the last few years, would now fall into that category that maybe they weren't there before because they at least thought their environment was more stable. But I think since 2020, we've all realized that stability is often a bit of a mirage.
Okay, my third and final term that I'm going to invite you to define here is adaptive capacity. What does that mean, and how does it relate to most of the folks listening today?
Yeah, when people think about adaptation, sometimes we have this idea in our mind where it's about reactivity, right? It's the idea of a quick response to a change or a altered situation, and there is some of that is accurate, right? But what people don't always understand is that the ability to do that in the moment didn't start at that moment, right? It was actually oftentimes built within the overflow, the capacity of the team ahead of time. And so it was creating the space, creating the experience, the expertise, the right kind of a culture. So in many ways, it's saving up kind of your capital, if you will, the team's capital, so that in that moment you can spend that capital to change and to move and to shift. And so that adaptive capacity is kind of that savings bank. Have you put enough time and energy into the savings bank of the team so that when that change comes, they can pay it out, if you will, and react in rapid succession and in a way that ultimately isn't just about change, but it's change that allows them to get ahead.
Interesting. And so I think this next question ties into the ability to build that capacity. And so here it is. Let me see if I'm on the right track here. You write about the importance of having generally simple rules and situational specific simple rules. You write about the importance of rules, simple rules, when teams are trying to adapt in uncertain environments. Are these rules what build adaptive capacity? And can you give us some examples of how that works and why these rules are so important?
Yeah. So you're 100% spot on, right? That simple rules are one mechanism to build that capacity, but a very important one. Eisenhart and Saul wrote a great book about simple rules that does a fantastic job of kind of laying out some different examples and telling some fantastic stories. One that I'll share here, that is kind of taken on a mythical folklore, is around the fire in Notre Dame in 2019. And if you recall some of those images, it was something straight out of the Dante's Inferno, almost a hellacious kind of view where these incredible flames are just engulfing the cathedral. And as the story goes, a number of different fire departments are rallying to the actual site, and the fire chief calls his folks together, and before they rush in, he establishes a simple prioritizing rule, and that is people first, art second, furniture third, structure last, go. And by creating those simple prioritization rules, when their adrenaline was pumping, right? When they're looking around and they feel the heat and they're rushing into this type of dangerous situation, they already had this kind of heuristic, this decision-making model that was at the forefront of their thinking. So that when they ran in and saw a wall engulfed in flame and then looked over and saw a portrait, they knew immediately, well, portrait was number 2 on the list. Grab the portrait, run out of the building without having to weigh a bunch of different options in their mind. It also allowed them to be coordinated, even without the fire chief directing their actions, because they were all playing off the same sheet of music, if you will. And so that's another benefit of those types of simple rules is not only do they help to reduce emotional response in the moment, not only does it improve decision quality when they're set appropriately at the beginning, but it also allows for that kind of coordinated, rapid action that allows for teams to be adaptive in the moment without necessarily having to talk through all of the different scenarios.
In your work with clients, do you find that most teams have established these simple rules, or is this something they need to do?
Yeah, it's interesting because oftentimes there are some underlying simple rules that the leader believes to be true and believes that the team knows, but they don't really, right? And how oftentimes do we talk to a leader and say, well, what's your priorities? And they go, oh, it's really clear. And then if you were to ask the team has no idea, right? Or they have a different set of priorities than the leader does. And so what we see is that people will kind of create their own simple rules, their own types of, as I call them, heuristics, ways of just trying to make quick decisions throughout life. But very few teams effectively do it in a intentional and coordinated way that actually makes life easier for people.
So how do teams do that better? How do we establish those simple rules in a way that does, in fact, make life easier for people?
Yeah. So first, a big part of that needs to be that it happens before the action takes place, right? For example, when the fire chief, again, was calling his people together, he wasn't yelling the simple rules as they're already in the fire, right? He's not calling out after them. He established it before they had to run into the burning building. And so that's the first thing that leaders really need to do is to take a proactive stance to this. Think through what are the simple rules that we need to be establishing for us to be successful that align with our strategy, that are going to help us achieve our objectives. So that's the first piece. The actual rules themselves, they really need to have 3 characteristics. First, they need to be actionable. And what I mean by that is simple rules aren't principles or values. There's certainly a place for those, but simple rules are more tangible. They help you make a clear decision. Instead of doing X, I'm going to do Y. Or if this certain amount of time takes place, then I have to take this particular action. So they allow people to take very clear, precise action in the moment, even if circumstances change. So they have to be actionable. The next thing they need to do is they have to be understandable. And what I mean by that is that there can be no room for grayness, right, or interpretation. Everyone on the team must understand exactly what it means, which means they have to be concrete. You can't just leave them a little bit vague or ambiguous. It has to make sure that everyone not only understands them, but can apply them in the same type of way. The third one needs to be that they are memorable. When you're in the midst of a crisis or a challenging situation or changes are taking place, all of us have our adrenaline pumping in that moment, right? And there are lots of things flooding our mind, and we may be concerned about our welfare or the welfare of a teammate. And in that moment, these simple rules have to be top of mind. And so you can't have a simple rule that is a paragraph long with lots of if-then statements. It needs to be something that is easily memorized and applied so that in the midst of that challenge, it is right there at their fingertips so that they can use it.
So I guess, David, that's another great example might be how pilots train and operate when they meet certain conditions in the aircraft, in the air. They know how to respond. They drill on those. There are clear documents on and checklists on what to do. Is that an example of simple rules?
Yeah, that's a perfect example. That they oftentimes have a clear prioritization list of, if there's an engine failure, do X, Y, and Z. And again, even the checklist, right? There's a degree to which, we talk oftentimes about simple rules in these moments of chaos and crisis because it's kind of sexy and it's more interesting. But even them knowing that you don't, start the engines until you do this checklist, that's a simple rule that seems pretty basic. And yet, how many countless lives have been saved by people going through that process, adhering to that simple rule, and recognizing that there was something wrong with a part of the engine that they needed to then address. While it might have frustrated us who were sitting in the back cabin waiting for the pilot to take off, it may very well have saved our lives because these folks were following simple rules in their daily practice.
And you contend that this simple rules approach would also apply to someone working in a retail setting and in a manufacturing environment. These simple rules are not just for those high reliability sort of roles, but they're for all of us.
Yeah. And I think, those high reliability types of organizations, think again, fire departments or surgical teams and things of that nature, the high risk that they're going through oftentimes necessitates this belief around simple rules and making sure everyone's on the same page, because oftentimes real lives are at risk. The retail stores and groups of designers and engineers and that type of thing, the simple rules apply just as much, but oftentimes are ignored because the impetus to really make sure everyone's on the same page isn't quite as visceral. And so I would argue, yes, it is just as important and maybe actually becomes a differentiator, that the truly great teams, the companies that are successful, do this in a very intentional way that allows their employees, especially in this new hybrid world that we often work in, to continue to be coordinated, to continue to drive forward, and to have that ability to react to situations that they're facing on the front lines, because the guardrails have already been set in place.
Yeah, I think the key word you just used was intentional. And I'll add another word, diligence and maybe vigilance in terms of making sure we have those rules. Let's move on. Does experience play a role in adaptive capacity? In other words, the Navy SEALs, many of them are, not right off the block, and then they're on a SEAL team, dropping into some exotic location to, take care of business. Many of these folks on the teams have a lot of experience. They bring a lot of experience. How does experience play into adaptive capacity? And is there any way to teach or accelerate this experience, or is it just a matter of time?
Yeah, it's really interesting because there's a couple of different ways why experience is such an important component or ingredient into the adaptive capacity. Carl Weick's work, when he was talking about different types of teams and improvisation, really hit on this incredibly well, recognizing, again, it's this kind of, you had to save up your savings for a while in this kind of vein of experience in order to really have that ability to flex in the moment. The experience really helps in a couple of different ways. First, at the individual level, when you have that kind of individual experience that you can rely on, what it does is it helps you to apply some of those simple rules in a more effective way, because you've seen something similar to this before, some sort of adjacency that you can say, well, maybe it's not quite the same, but in this case, this type of thing worked, and I could probably use that again. So it allows people to make better judgments of how to apply some of these simple rules and guardrails to allow them to make better decisions in the moment. it also allows for this kind of more divergent thinking that oftentimes creates some of the most valuable insights and novel approaches. Is that, when you've only seen one type of way something being applied, that becomes kind of your Bible, if you will. It becomes the automatic knee-jerk reaction of what to do. But when you've lived a bit of life and seen a number of different experiences, you can start to draw from that type of diverse perspective. And that's only magnified when you actually do it in a collective sense, because now you can pull that diverse experience from the team itself. And that allows, again, not only for the ability to adapt, but really to draw from these kind of novel perspectives in a way that sometimes causes friction, but oftentimes it's that friction that creates that kind of really beautiful spark that leads to a new solution.
So,
The other thing, go ahead.
I was just going to ask you to hit that follow-up question. Is there a way to teach or accelerate or help teams leverage experience in a more effective way?
Yeah, you mentioned at the very beginning of the podcast around some of the simulations, and I think oftentimes you can accelerate it by placing people into those kind of more experiential type trainings. Simply telling them how they ought to act in certain circumstances doesn't usually do it for you, right? And if you kind of just leave it to chance, over time, people will gain that experience, but it ends up being kind of more accidental. The simulations, what it allows it to do is not only build that kind of practice experience, it allows people to mess up in a way that they can learn without necessarily really causing threat or risk to themselves or others. And that's the reason why so many, again, high reliability types of teams, these action teams, do practice frequently. It's not just so that they can go through the motions. It's actually creating this type of experience that's logged deep into their mind that they can pull from when inevitably the situation is different, right? But it allows them to actually move and act in a way that's going to deliver it. If you go back to there's the old saying, I believe it was Eisenhower said it, that plans are useless, but planning is essential, right? In many ways, that planning is kind of like a simulation. It allows people to not only develop that bank to pull from, but it also then, when you do it in a team setting, creates that shared experience. And the value of that shared experience now is that not only do I have a bank to pull from, but I can actually start to develop trust and familiarity with my teammates in a way that I understand how they are going to react in a situation, for better and for worse. And that allows me to have a more predictive action. So now I can get ahead of the game. I can move more rapidly because I know that so-and-so is going to act this way, and this individual over here is probably going to be feeling this, and so they'll probably take this action. And so it helps to expedite the process and allows you to be that much more adaptive in a shorter time frame.
And that's probably why, after somebody performs some heroic feat, they respond to a dangerous situation, a police officer, a firefighter, a first responder, and then they're interviewed afterwards. The expression we most often hear is, well, my training just kicked in.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that explains it all. And that's why that training is so important. Let's move on. There's an old expression that says, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. But you found in your research that when the going gets tough, the tough really need to control their emotions, slow things down, and focus.
Mm-hmm.
How did you come to that conclusion?
Yeah, it was fairly fascinating. One of the sayings that the special operations community uses all the time is slow is smooth and smooth is fast. And so from the very beginning of their training, they are, indoctrinated into this idea that when things get really chaotic, slow down. And, it's even fascinating that a number of the individuals I talked to talked about how when things got real bad, when bullets started flying and the plan completely broke down, it felt as though the entire world just slowed down and that they became more calm. There's been documented cases, even with the, American sniper, the way that he had talked about it in times where, Kyle, actually, they found his pulse rate and breathing slowed down in the midst of chaos. And so just that basic idea seems so surreal to me, that these individuals would find that common peace. And part of it, I think, is exactly from your point about the training, is that as the training kicks in, as these simple rules start to play out in front of them, they already kind of have a cognitive playbook that they're playing off of. So they don't have to think quite as rapidly in the moment while still reacting. The other piece that was really fascinating to me was not only did they talk about that, but I asked them about communication. And they said, oh, in the midst of the crisis, we communicate less. And I remember thinking the first individual who told me that, I thought, well, that's not true. That can't be possibly true, right? Because everyone always says when things go bad, you need to communicate more and over communicate. And as I started to ask each participant the same question, they all said the exact same thing. And so I started to peel apart, trying to understand, well, what do you mean you communicate less? And finally, someone gave me the key to it. And they said, well, it's not a matter of communicate less as much as we communicate in a very focused way, that we know exactly what communication is essential and what they don't need. And there is no room for that kind of filler, because that filler takes the person away from, it distracts them, takes their attention away from the risk that they're facing right in front of them. And so that's been a real interesting way to look at this, is that as the chaos increases, many of us have a gut reaction to jam the accelerator, get out there, do something. And this, bias for action, there is some value to that, but it always has to be in this controlled manner. And so this concept of slow is smooth and smooth is fast really has played itself out, and I think is a fundamental reason why so many action teams are successful, is that they take that, what you might call a strategic pause.
One of the other factors that affect performance and ultimately success on these action teams is the importance of relationships. How important are, in your research, what did you find about the importance of relationships between team members on action teams? And then as a follow-up question, if you would, what factors affect the quality of these relationships? In other words, what I'd like to know is, how do we build better relationships on our teams at work?
Yeah. At the root of almost all these was this idea of trust. And, again, what was fascinating is that's not a surprising concept, right? The idea that trust is so critical to high performing teams. But the reason why it was important, at least to the SEAL teams, was interesting to me, because what it was about oftentimes was the trust was a factor that encouraged innovation and creativity, flexibility, if you will. Because what they would say is, well, if that person goes off script, I trust that they're doing it for a good reason. Even though I may not understand it, I'm assuming positive intent.
Right.
I'm assuming that there's a good reason for why they are doing that. But it had to be that trust already really rooted long before that. I love a trust model that's been, widely popularized by, I think it's Miles and Sherman. But at the end of the day, we oftentimes talk about trust as a singular idea. And that's a little bit of a misconception. It's really a composite of 3 different ingredients. And those ingredients are benevolence, competence, and then we've kind of talked about it as reliability, but the original research talked about it as integrity. And so if you don't have all three of these components, that trust fundamentally isn't there, right? The benevolence to believe that an individual truly has your best interest and the best interest of the team at mind. So they're not out there just simply trying to get ahead. The competence that they can do what they say that they're going to do, right? You know that they're going to execute to standard. And that reliability, when it really comes to this idea that I can depend on them. I know that at the end of the day, they will have the integrity to do what needs to be done. And I can really rely on that predictive nature of who they are. When you have all those three, that's when you got the trust. And in the Navy SEALs perspective, it was that trust that allowed them to take immediate actions, knowing that their brothers were fully behind them and would kind of underwrite the risk that might come with those innovative, creative solutions.
David, it's hard to believe, but our time for this episode is almost up. So I want to ask the question I ask of all my guests. And that's, what's one thing that the leaders who are listening to this show today can begin doing tomorrow, the next day, next week, to become more effective as leaders, based on what you do in training leaders, based on your research? What's one thing that we can all start doing to become better leaders?
Yes, a great question. And I'm going to start with actually where we left off here, because the ideas of adaptive capacity and dynamic instability and simple rules, none of that works without trust, right? None of that can actually be applied if that trust is not at the foundation of the team. And we all, frankly, need to work on trust. We can all be better as leaders. And oftentimes, no matter how self-aware we believe we are, there's often, some areas that maybe we're a little blind to. And so one of the things that we often do with leaders is we give them this model that I just talked about, right? And kind of show like three overlapping circles of competence, benevolence, and reliability. And then what we inform them to do is say, go back to your teams and tell them, if I had to work on one of these, you can't say none, but you have to pick one of these that I could work on to build trust better with you, or to build trust better with my peer or with that other team. Which one of these should we work on? That simple conversation will be incredibly powerful, because you'll start to have an insight into not only how you are viewed as a leader, but where you can start to make a real difference right away. It's a hard conversation, and you can't let them be out like, oh no, boss, you're great at all of them, right? You have to force them to say, no, you have to choose one, because none of us are fully at the finish line of our journeys. We all have work to do. And if we can at least start that conversation as a leader and as a team, that's going to start moving us greater toward that place of true trust within the team and between different teams, and allows us to start acting as a gardener, people that we can start to build the team around us to help them fulfill the potential that they need. But it's always going to be rooted in that trust as that foundation.
That's great advice, David. I'm sure many of our listeners have been intrigued by what you've shared with us, the nature of this conversation. How can people get in touch with you if they want to learn more about your work, maybe connect with you personally, or learn more about the work of the McChrystal Group?
Yeah, I would love to connect with the folks who are out there. One, probably the easiest way is through LinkedIn. That's an easy way that I jump on every day, and would love to make those connections there and have some conversations. The other way that's probably the simplest is through the McChrystal Group website. By going to that website, not only can you connect with the organization, but there's actually an insights tab that has a number of different articles that I and a number of my colleagues have written. And they're highly focused on how do you apply some of these interesting ideas. There's articles, videos, playbooks. It's all free. You just have to kind of put your email in there. and it's really a resource that we want you to spread and to use amongst your teams, because at the end of the day, we really believe that teams and leaders are how organizations are successful. And if there's any little thing that we can do to help those organizations out there, we're happy to do it. So those are the two main ways, and I look forward to connecting with folks.
David, thanks for being a great guest on the Mission First People Always podcast. I, for one, think your research is incredibly useful for those of us who work in fast-changing environments. And if our recent past has taught us anything, there will be more change to come, more instability, more volatility in store for us in 2023 and beyond. I can also attest to the outstanding work of the McChrystal Group. I think you guys are a first-class operation, and the work you're doing is truly making a difference. And to my listeners, thank you for being part of today's podcast. If you've liked something you've heard today, leave a review. It will help people find us. Tell a friend, subscribe, follow. Really, the only reason I do this podcast is to help leaders lead more effectively and build stronger teams. So I'm trying to get the good word out about good leadership, and that's what's important to me. So until next time, stay focused on your mission and take good care of your people.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to create a stronger, more people-centric and empowered culture for your organization, visit drmikepatterson.com.